Some 20 years ago or so, an author wrote about an experience at a conference at a Presbyterian church in Omaha. This was a church that had as its history a very reserved expression of worship. That is, they had by and large been a church who did not outwardly express by shouting or arms raised, did not outwardly express worship. Now, for a moment, let me say that's one of the things I'm so encouraged by our great God and the work He's doing at Green Acres Baptist Church. As He brings together a diversity of people, there are some who come and their expression of worship is a reserved expression, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as their hearts are worshiping. And there are others who come and their expressions of worship are arm raised or shouting out loud, and there is nothing wrong with that as long as our hearts are shouting to the Lord too, right? And so one of the things I love is to see the variety of experiences, expressions of worship, and I'm praying that God would teach us all to express worship in a way that would build this body. But in this particular church, it had as its history a very reserved expression of worship. And so the pastor decided one Sunday that he wanted, and this is, as far as I know, actually a true event that happened about 20 years ago. The pastor there in Omaha decided he would give his people an opportunity to express their joy and praise throughout the worship service. And so as people came in to the sanctuary that Sunday morning, they were given a helium-filled balloon on a string. A long string. And that as they experienced joy, everybody received one, or at least each family or almost every person. And as they experienced joy in their hearts throughout worship, they were to release the balloon and it would float to the air, and then people would know they were expressing joy because maybe they just didn't feel comfortable shouting or arms raised or saying hallelujah, much like we do at Green Acres at times. So throughout the service, music was sung, the pastor preached, and balloons were let go, and throughout the service they saw balloons drift to the ceiling as people expressed their joy. And at the end of the service, the pastor initially was encouraged by seeing all the balloons floating at the top of the sanctuary, which represented the joy people experienced in worship, but he found something that troubled him. When it was over, almost a third of the balloons had not been released. 1/3 of the people in the service were saying, in an opportunity to tangibly express their joy, at least 1/3 of the congregation said, I had no joy in worship today. God is a very, very gracious God. There is a reason an entire book called Philippians was written all about being joyful. And there is a reason Paul said, I'll say it again, and it does not trouble me to say it again. I've said it repeatedly, rejoice in all things. The good news is we are not required to have a joyful situation to have joy. Pastor, if you knew my situation, here's the good news. In God's economy, He can actually enable us to have joy in spite of the fact that we may not have a joyful situation. But, the graciousness of God is this: as we live our lives, God does have a gracious way of bringing us into joyful experiences and meetings and events along the way. And while we don't need a joyful event or experience to have joy in our hearts, the good news is God is so gracious, He does provide us joyful events, joyful experiences, and joyful meetings as we live and walk with Him. This morning, I want to talk a little bit about a joyful journey. If you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 29. Genesis, chapter 29. As we continue to follow our hero, Jacob. The third patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Later we'll meet Joseph. Jacob's life has experienced a heavy favoritism of his father for his brother Esau, and yet a favoritism for him coming from his mother. Jacob has experienced a situation where, while his father was going to give the blessing to the wrong brother, he and his mother, sneaking, deceptively, quote unquote, stole that blessing. They didn't really, it was going to him anyway, but they decided to get it deceptively. They did. It created a fracture in his family. And I was just thinking this past couple of weeks, a fracture unlike many of us have ever experienced. I know, to some degree, all of us have dysfunctional families. And until we get to heaven, there's no perfection. So I guess all of us are a little dysfunctional. And some of us, some have experienced much more dysfunctional families than others. But I got to tell you, Jacob, the family he grew up in was highly dysfunctional. And it ended up him running away to a foreign land to find a wife, or a foreign land where he would eventually find a wife. Really, he was running away because his brother had vowed to murder him when their father died. Now, that's dysfunction. And so Jacob left his home, and when he left his home, he left a brother and a mother and a father, a brother who did not know the Lord, Esau. And quite frankly, I'm convinced that at the point where Jacob left his family, he didn't know the Lord. By the way, mamas and daddies, can I suggest to you that Jacob is a great example? Don't quit praying for your children if they're not saved. Because last week we looked at an experience in Jacob's life that would change him forever. He was all by himself, heading north to the land where his uncle Laban lived, and that's where he would spend some time. He was heading north. He was by himself, all alone, and he went one night to go to sleep. Literally, things were so bad, he laid his head on a rock, all alone, out in the middle of nowhere, no family with him, no friends with him. You think you're alone? Can I suggest to you that sometimes the best place God can get you is all alone? There are times where the best thing for us is not to have that little bridge of a person that just kind of helps us along. Sometimes we're better off to be out in the middle of the ocean in 100-foot deep water with no life preserver. And that's where God comes and saves us. And so that's kind of where Jacob was in his life. He was all alone. No one around him. You say, Pastor, sometimes I feel like I don't have many friends. I feel like I don't have someone I can rely on. Well, talk to Jacob. He laid his head down one night on a rock out in the middle of nowhere, dark. But in the middle of the night, a vision came to him. Not a vision, God came to him and gave him a vision. It's a vision of angels going up and down on this ladder. And before things were over, Jacob had experienced, I'm convinced, what would be a conversion. That is, I'm convinced the end of Genesis chapter 28 is Jacob's conversion experience. Now, later on, in a couple of chapters, Jacob will experience another spiritual revival, spiritual renewal. But if we were going to talk about being born again, so to speak, I'm convinced that here at the end of chapter 28 is Jacob's time, where he honestly, surely begins to walk with the Lord. In fact, we see at the end of chapter 28, verses 20 through 22, while Jacob's understanding of following God is very immature, he actually lays some qualifications on God. Nevertheless, he still says, Lord, I'm ready to follow you. How many of you know that the day you're born again, there's still a whole lot you don't know about walking with the Lord? Right? And yet, God still saves us. I think about the day I was born again and the hundreds of things, or the enormous number of things I didn't know about walking with the Lord. That didn't keep God from saving me, thankfully. What I did know was what I needed to know. That is, Jesus Christ was my way to have forgiveness of sin that separated me from God. And when I gave my life over to Him, He would then give me forgiveness and life back. And I was saying, I am prepared to follow you now with my life. When I was born again, that's what happened. And then since then, I've learned a whole lot about walking with the Lord. And guess what? I still have a whole lot more to learn. And so Jacob, I'm convinced, in spite of the rudimentary fashion that he understood following God, I'm still convinced that the end of chapter 28 was his conversion experience. And it changed his life. And from this point on, everything would be perfect in Jacob's life, right? Because that's what happens when you get born again, right? Everything's perfect, everything's okay, and there are no more troubles in life. Jacob's going to have a lot of trouble in his life. He's going to walk through a lot of challenges, but I'm going to tell you something. Something changes in Jacob when he's transformed into a follower of God at the end of chapter 28. Even chapter 29, the first sentence of it, we're going to see it in just a moment, begins with a brand new Jacob. And we're going to take a look at Genesis 29, verses 1 through 14. Now watch this. As we do, we are going to find some joys in walking with Christ. I'm not saying that when you get born again, everything will be ascension, everything will be good all the time. What I am saying is while you walk with Christ, He provides some joyful experiences in our lives that only can come from the gracious hand of God. And so let me give you a summary real quick before we begin to look at the text. Basically, what's going to happen is Jacob's going to end up in the land where his uncle Laban lives. He's going to come upon a well. Do not dismiss the importance of wells and water throughout the Scriptures. That's one of those symbols. I realize sometimes people try to make a symbol of everything, and it's not necessarily that in the Scriptures, but wells and water are an important symbol throughout the Scripture. Jacob's going to come upon a well. At that well, he is going to meet for the first time his cousin. And as he meets his cousin, Rachel, he's going to also then be introduced to his uncle for the first time, Uncle Laban. Laban is not new to our story, folks. And it is in this meeting, it is in this experience, verses 1 through 14, that we are going to see some joyful experiences God can also put in our lives. Now, here's what we're going to do. As we're studying through these, I want us to say, Lord, can you show me, remind me, Lord, I am discouraged today. Lord, I am down today. Lord, I'm just not sure what I am today. But Lord, I'm praying that before I leave this service, you would help me to see some joyful experiences you've put in my life. Because here's the fact. When tough times hit, a lot of times we just completely forget the joyful things God's done. And if we're not careful, tough times hit, trials hit, and we get in the midst of those trials, and sometimes we think, Lord, don't you ever do anything good for me? Now, we wouldn't say it out loud, maybe. Maybe we would. But we might not say it out loud, but in our minds, sometimes we're thinking of that. Can't something just work out for me? And before we leave here today, I want to take a look at a few joyful experiences God puts in our lives. And I want you to walk away from here today saying, you know what, Lord, right now it's tough, but I'm going to thank you for these joyful things you've put in my life, because they are very good. Some joyful experiences in walking with Christ. Some potential joyful experiences. Look at chapter 29, beginning in verse 1. So Jacob went on his journey. That is, after Jacob left his dream, left the place where he was alone, left the place where he saw the dream at night, the ladder with angels ascending and descending. It says he left. Now watch this. Where it says Jacob went, that is a Hebrew word that implies eagerness, hurry, almost rushing. In fact, one translation I read, kind of a literal translation, said, and Jacob picked up his feet. There is an implication here that something changed about Jacob's journey before chapter 28, the end of it, and after. There is a strong suggestion that Jacob's joy in the journey, Jacob's anticipation, Jacob's eagerness, where before the end of chapter 28, it was a drudgery trip, if you will. It was a trip he had to make. And now after, it's a trip he gets to make. Where before, it was a trip he was doing because he was supposed to. He's now doing the trip because he gets to. It is a word, it's one word, I realize. You say, Pastor John, that's an awful lot with one word. You're right. Scriptures are just that way. But Jacob meets with God. Jacob meets with God. And after he meets with God in chapter 28, things seem to change. And so Jacob picks up his feet and came to the land of the people of the east. So he arrives at the end of his journey. Let me point something out. The Bible is the master of the understatement, right? From where Jacob left back in chapter 28, verse 5. Chapter 28, verse 5 to chapter 29, verse 1 is 400 miles. 400 miles. How long does it take generally, if you got an interstate with decent traffic, how long does it take to drive 400 miles, give or take? Say it again. 4 hours and 30 minutes. I don't want to ride with you, brother. About 6 hours. There's a man who drives, though. He knows, yeah. It all depends. If you got to go through Atlanta, 8 hours, right? If you got to go through Atlanta at 5, 8.5 hours. So you can picture that. Now, anybody know how long it takes to walk 400 miles? I'm not talking about with a sidewalk and walking paths. Yeah, a long stinking time, right? A long time. So from Genesis chapter 28, verse 5 to Genesis chapter 29, verse 1, Jacob has walked a long, long journey. But could I suggest to you that the journey Jacob's walked is far longer than 400 miles? In that journey, that 400-mile journey, God did something in Jacob's heart, all alone. Do you think there were times on that 400-mile walk that he thought, I might never get there? Have there been times in whatever you're trying to achieve or in the back of your mind you're going, I just don't know if I'm ever going to get there? Have there been times in the back of your mind, in a walk you're trying to make, a goal you're trying to set, a dream you have, you say, I just don't know if I'm ever going to get there? Could I suggest to you that God did more in that 400 miles in Jacob's life than he had done in decades before? And so here we have Jacob showing up in chapter 29. Folks, let me tell you something. God may do more in your 400-mile journey, whatever it is. Maybe your 400-mile journey is a financial issue, it's a health issue, it's a relational issue, it's a goal issue, something you're working towards. It's your 400-mile journey like Jacob walked. And I'm telling you, God's doing something in your heart. And He'll do more in that one journey than He's done in years. He did it in Jacob's life. In fact, He did it in one night in Jacob's life, didn't He? How many of you bet, though, God had been preparing Jacob long before that night on the rock? So chapter 29, verse 1, so Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east, and he looked and saw a well in the field and beyond. And behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it, for out of that well they watered the flocks. A large stone was on the well's mouth. Let me tell you something, folks. A well was a big, big deal back then, at that place, in that time. It was a dry region. It was a desert-type region. And sometimes one well would water the flocks and provide water for the people of several communities. And so the well we're looking at here, I don't think is it a 50-foot well? Is it a 100-foot well? A 120-foot well? Remember the first church I pastored was a church plant out on the edge of Byron, Crawford County. And I remember our well, that's a kind of a very sandy surface. We only had to go down about 60 feet to strike water. This well's different. This is probably more of a reservoir. A reservoir that they would have laid a large flat stone over the top. That large flat stone would generally have a round hole in the middle of it where they would lay another stone. That's the stone they would take off and put back on, and the animals could literally walk up to the edge and drink from it. You say, oh, Pastor Johnny, you mean the people use the same water as the animals? Or what you going to do? Just not have water at all? They didn't have all the EPA requirements for water cleanliness in the day. And so they used what they had. But that's probably the kind of well we have here. Verse 3. Now all the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stone from the well's mouth, water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the well's mouth. Why a big stone over the cover, Pastor Johnny? Well, think about this. We're in a very dry, arid region. First of all, evaporation would be an issue. Second of all, animals getting in it, dying, contaminating the water would be a problem. And so it was important. It was important to keep the well covered and to uncover it as little as possible. In verse 4, and Jacob said to them, my brethren, where are you from? And they said, we are from Haran. That's a big deal. Jacob's been looking for that area for a long time. His 400-mile walk, that's what he's been heading for. He can now see the light at the end of the tunnel. Verse 5, and he said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. Hot dog. I can think Jacob in his mind, I can actually picture the fact that I'm going to come to the end of this journey. I'm just telling you, folks, sometimes we're on a journey and sometimes it's like we can't even see the end. From time to time, I'll talk to college students and I'll ask the question, which oftentimes we ask, how long do you have until you're finished? And sometimes I'll follow that up with, or is it so long you don't even want to think about the end yet? You just want to think about your next set of classes. Because sometimes that graduation date and all the 186 hours we still got to take before you get to the end, sometimes it's so much you don't even want to think about the end. You just want to think about getting through the next semester. And so there were times, I'm sure, where Jacob thought, it's so far away, I'm not even going to think about the end because I'm not sure if it's going to come. And so here he is. I'm sure inside he's getting excited. Verse 6, and he said to them, is he, Laban, is he well? And they said, he is well. Whew. I'd hate to come 400 miles and Laban keeled over while I was walking here and somebody else is in charge, and what am I going to do now, right? A whole lot can happen in your 400-mile journey. You're walking, seeking the Lord. A whole lot can happen. Could I suggest to you that we serve a sovereign God? Whatever happens, it's going to be what we need. It's going to be what's best for us. And so they say, and look, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. Let me stop there for just a moment. One of the possible joys in walking with Christ is this. Watch this. A meaningful encounter of God's people. A meaningful encounter of God's people. I just wonder at this point, how long had it been since Jacob had really even had a conversation, an encounter with a group of people? He had been walking by himself. He had been trudging through the wilderness and the mountains. And if you've ever been in that area of Israel, you'll know it's a very mountainous area. That's not an easy walk. You take how long it might take one of us to walk 400 miles and maybe double it, just because of the terrain. And how long had it been since he'd really had a meaningful conversation with people or been near people who were his family? And here he comes, he ends up at a well and has a meaningful encounter with some of God's people. God's sovereignty is at work in such a way that oftentimes relationships and special encounters come our way in ways we did not expect. And so could I suggest to you that while you're walking through the journey God has you, one of the things He provides for you is meaningful encounters of God's people. We live in relationships. One of the things you learn as you get older is that the relationships you build throughout your life are critical. They're important. Those are the relationships with people are really the things that matter so much. One of the things I'm learning as a pastor, investing in people and relationships. Start first with my family and then with others, working my way up. Those are the critical things. And so God's so good to give us these relationships. There is a story that comes back from the 13th century when Emperor Frederick ruled in Rome. Frederick decided to do really a rather crude and, by the way, cruel experiment, really. It was a long, long time ago. Frederick decided that he wanted to know what was man's original language. It's almost humorous if it weren't so cruel. You'll hear what that is in just a moment. He wanted to know, is Hebrew, Greek, or Latin a human being's native tongue, original language? And so he decided to do an experiment to find out what would be a child's native language without anything interfering. And so he took a handful of infants, newborns, and he removed them from the sound of any human voice. And he hired he brought in some wet nurses, that is to nurse them and take care of them. And the wet nurses were sworn to absolute silence. And he wanted to see what language would these babies first speak. Now, I know in the back of your mind going, that's stupid. I know it sounds that way, but at the time, he felt this was the best way to figure out what is the natural language. And so he took this group of infants, swore the wet nurses to absolute silence, and they abided by the rule. For months, the infants never heard a word from a single human voice. And according to the story, within a year, all of them had died. We live in relationships, don't we? And when God walking us through our journey, in those times where you feel like you don't have anything to be joyful about, could I suggest you begin to think back to the joyful relationships, the meaningful relationship, the meaningful encounters God's brought you? Oh, Pastor, I don't have any. Really? I beg to differ. The fact that you're sitting here today tells me you've got some kind of relationships, even in this fellowship. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your neighbor. Maybe it's a friend from school. Maybe it's someone you've met right here in this church body. Could I suggest to you, if you're a part of this church, you've got people who care about you and would help you and uplift you if they knew there's a need. And so let me suggest to you that one of the things God does as we walk through a journey with Christ is He brings us into meaningful encounters with God's people. And that's reason to have joy. Look at verse 7. Then he said, "Look, it is still high day." That is Jacob. "Look, it is still high day. It is not time for the cattle to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go feed them." Now, he sees Rachel coming. I get the impression here that he's trying to get these guys out of the way so Rachel can get her sheep watered. And you say, well, what is Rachel doing with the sheep? Back in that time, for large families and sheep ranchers, if you will, their oldest son might oversee the sheep. Or oftentimes, if they had a single unmarried daughter who was the youngest, oftentimes she would oversee the sheep. In this case, that's what Rachel's doing. And so it appears that Jacob's simply trying to get folks out of the way so Rachel can get in line to water her sheep. Verse 8, "But they said, we cannot water them, that is, until all the flocks are gathered together, and they have rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Then we water the sheep." Now watch this. Their point, we wait till all the flocks get here, and then we uncover the well. That way, we'll only have to uncover the well one time rather than multiple times and risk dirt or contamination into the well. Well, see, that wasn't good enough for Jacob. Because he sees Rachel coming, he sees her sheep, it's part of his family. And later on, we're going to find out much more happens between Jacob and Rachel. But at this point, this is a meaningful encounter with him. And look at what he does. By the way, these stones that would normally cover the wells generally would take a very strong person or even a couple of people to move it. So it wasn't an easy thing to do. Verse 9. "Now while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess." I just explained that. "And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, and Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother." Now Jacob, he may have been a homebody, but he wasn't no pansy, apparently. Now remember, Jacob was the guy who liked to stay at home. He must have been doing Pilates or something while he was at home, because this guy's strong, right? He's doing P90X or T25 or AH30 or whatever. He's working out somehow, because generally speaking, it took a couple of people to move these stones. And Jacob said, you know what? This lady's coming. She's beautiful. She's my cousin. She's my family. I'm moving the stone. I don't care what these people say. And so he does. Let me tell you what's interesting. Kind of a flashback of sorts. A flashback. If you go back to, I believe it is, Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24. Who remembers how Isaac got a wife? Anybody remember? The servant of who went out? Abraham, his father. Isaac's father sent a servant out to find Isaac a wife, right? Who would be Rebekah. Eliezer was the servant's name. Where did Eliezer first come in contact with Rebekah's people and Rebekah herself? At a well. And Rebekah's brother, he was the one that helped give Rebekah away. What was his name? Laban. It's come full circle. Eliezer went out to find Isaac a wife, found Isaac a wife named Rebekah. Rebekah was Laban's sister. Come back, Isaac and Rebekah get married. They have 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. And now Jacob is on his way on a trip. He comes across a well owned by Laban. And he's going to find a wife there too. There are no accidents, folks. But I like the fact that Jacob's heart seems to have changed. Do you really think he would have moved a stone for anybody before in his life? Quite frankly, Jacob's life had been pretty much chalked up to serving himself. But here what we have in verses 7 through 10, watch this. A joyful experience, and it is this, a ministry effort to God's people. Jacob actually is concerned about someone besides himself. Oh, Pastor Johnny, he's just trying to look like a stud for a beautiful woman. Well, maybe that's part of it. I don't know. Maybe. But I am saying this. He steps in and serves somebody else at a point where it could have cost him something. And so one of the joyful encounters in walking with Christ God gives us, not only is it a meaningful encounter of God's people, but it's also at times a ministry effort to God's people. Could I suggest to you that ministry is not an obligation, it is a joyful opportunity. And could I suggest to you that if you're walking with Christ, you will see it as that. It's not that I've got to go do this church-wise, it's I get to. It's not that I've got to go serve here, I get to. I love the fact, Pastor Brian pointed out, you may not have caught this. I love the fact that we had 30 volunteers. We had 30 volunteers. Green Acres Baptist Church had 30 volunteers at Camp Windshape. You say, well, yeah, Pastor Johnny, Camp Windshape was here. I'm not talking about the camp that was here. We had more than 30 volunteers serving here. But Camp Windshape last week was over at Central Baptist Church, and we had about 30 volunteers from Green Acres over there serving. Well, why would they do that? That's not on our campus. Simply because they desire to. Listen, tell me, there's something joyful about serving the Lord to those who love the Lord. And if you weren't over there, I'm not saying that you don't love the Lord. It's not my point. But that there are people over there who that was really not their deal, right? Quote unquote. And too often in churches we say, well, that's not my deal over there. I only do that's at my church. And that's, to some degree, that may be fine. I just know this. People serve not because they had to, just because they wanted to. And part of the joy in our lives is serving God. Verse 11. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. At this point, now let me clear, at this point, this is not a romantic kiss. It will become that later, but at this point it's not. In the Middle East, and even today, in ancient times, it was very common for people to greet one another with a kiss. In fact, men greeted one another with a kiss. There was nothing odd about it. It was just commonplace. And this is his family. And notice how excited he is. He lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. So she ran and told her father. Let me give you another joyful encounter sometimes God might give us. In addition to a meaningful encounter of God's people and a ministry effort, there's the joy in serving. There's also the joy in this, a moving experience with God's people. There are just those times where God gives us an emotional, powerful experience with God's people that sometimes we point back to. And even when times are going tough, we say, no, but I remember that time with that group of people, or with that person who helped me out, or with that experience at a retreat or a camp, or in a worship service. God gives us these overwhelmingly moving experiences. There are some of you sitting out there this morning, and you can think back in your life last year or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, and you can think of emotional, moving experiences God gave you with God's people around you. And sometimes those experiences keep you going when things are tough. Sometimes they keep you going. A moving experience with God's people. I'll never forget when Ellison and I, when I was pastor down at Ellison Baptist Church, and I've shared with many of you the story of how we lost a baby, but we were coming back after that all happened. We were coming back from the hospital, and I'll never forget arriving at home. And God had really worked in our hearts in a grand way, but we walked into the house. The house was spotless. The refrigerator was stocked with food. And just 2 or 3 other things, we realized God's people had descended on that house. And when we got home, to me, it was kind of an emotional experience knowing that God's people were there and we had this huge support. And there are times I think back to that situation, that experience. There are times I think back to experiences I've had right here at Green Acres Baptist Church with some of you, and I am encouraged by it. I bet there were things that happened at Metro Changers that some of these youth will think back to for years to come. Moving experiences they had. I remember last year after World Changers, some of our youth sharing testimonies about people they encountered and experiences they had with them, and those experiences have helped them, and they'll think back to them for years. Sometimes the experiences maybe a situation you've had with a family member or a parent or a child. God gives us these moving experiences. Now listen, it's not necessarily that He wants to live in these deep emotional experiences every day, because we'd get wrung out emotionally, right? But from time to time, He offers them, doesn't He? And He gives them to us, and they help us along. So God gives us a moving experience with God. Could I suggest to you today, if you're walking through a difficult time, maybe you take some time to sit down and think, you know what, Lord, can you help me remember some times when some people came into my life that You sent, God's people, that were just an emotional encouragement, an emotional strengthening in my life. A moving experience with God's people. This is trucking Jacob along. He's a different man. Verse 13. Then it came to pass, when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him. It had been 80 years before or so, around 80 years, that Laban had last time met a young man who had shown up at the well, looking for a young lady in his household. That time before was Laban's sister. Now it's Laban's daughter, right? That time before was a servant of Laban's relative. Now it's his nephew. And it came to pass when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. So he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. Sometimes the joyful encounters we get are not only a meaningful encounter with God's people and a ministry effort to serve God's people and a moving experience God provides us with God's people, but let me suggest sometimes the encounter is a major exchange around God's people. Really, points 3 and 4 are very, very similar, but I separated them for this point. You see the exchange that takes place between Laban and Jacob, and that will have an imprint on Jacob's life for years to come. Granted, Laban will be a trickster. Granted, Laban will trick him and deceive him. But at this point in Jacob's life, it is exactly what he needs. Can I suggest to you that God may send people into your life in a moment, in a time, that are exactly what you need at that moment? And that's no accident. And that's no happenstance. I don't know what's going on with you right now. Maybe life's going pretty good. Or maybe you're really facing some challenges. You know what? Maybe your challenges, if you told them to another person, they'd go, "Ha, ain't nothing." But for you, where you are, it is tough. That's your life, right? Or maybe you're facing some challenges right now that if you told someone else, they'd go, "Good grief. Boy, that sounds tough." I don't know what your situation is, but I can tell you this. God is a very gracious God. And we don't always have joyful circumstances, but we do have a God that from time to time provides us joyful situations to not only uplift us in those moments, but to carry us along down the road. And maybe that encounter is with God's people. Maybe it's in serving God's people. Maybe it's experiencing God's people. Maybe it's just an exchange with God's people. As we live our lives, God has a gracious way of bringing us into joyful meetings and experiences along the way. There's a 3rd century man who was anticipating death. He penned some last words to a friend. These were the words. As he anticipated death, here's what he said. "It's a bad world, an incredibly bad world. But I have discovered in the midst of it a quiet and holy people who have learned a great secret. They have found a joy which is 1,000 times better than any pleasure of our sinful life. They are despised and persecuted, but they care not." This is the 3rd century. "They are masters of their souls. They have overcome the world. These people are the Christians, and I am one of them." I certainly can't say I'm anticipating a death near. I mean, none of us has a promise for tomorrow, but I'm saying physically, getting along pretty good, and many of you may be too. So maybe you're not anticipating something as momentous as passing on. But maybe you're just anticipating something like a bill that's coming or difficulty at your job. Maybe you're just anticipating some difficulty in your family coming up. Could I suggest to you that maybe there are some things that may happen to some of us this week that we're not anticipating at all? It's going to be a surprise. It's going to catch us by surprise. It's going to knock us off our feet. It's going to cause us to stumble because it's such a shock. And could I suggest that whether you know what's coming or you don't, that you remember this: God is a gracious God. He calls us to joy, but as a good God, He very graciously provides joyful experiences along the way. Maybe it's having lost a loved one in your family, a spouse or a child or someone you're close to, a grandparent or a parent. Could I suggest to you that God gave you some joyful experiences with them along the way that are helping you now to look back and you say, what a joy I had with them. There's a movie out right now called America. The premise of it is, what would the world be like if there had been no America? I've not seen it, but I think from what I've heard, it was probably recommendable. Anyway, we may, in the same way that this movie looks back and says, what would the world be like if there had been no America? Maybe we want to look back and say, Lord, what would my life be like if I didn't have these joyful experiences along the way, these people in my life? And while now maybe these people have gone and I'm sad over that, what would my life be like if I had not had them? And then, Lord, what would my life be like if it wasn't for Jesus Christ? When we're walking with Christ, could I suggest to you today that if you know Jesus, as you walk with Christ, God provides you these air holes along the way, these joyful experiences. Don't just walk past them and forget about them. No, God put them there to help you. He didn't have to. He's not obligated to, but He does because He loves you. And maybe today's a time for you to come and get on this altar and just say, Lord, can you help me be refreshed by remembering the joyful things You've put in my life, the joyful experiences. Lord, I've been down, and Lord, I've been kind of just a little bit of a pity party. But Lord, I'm asking that You would just help Strengthen me again by remembering these joyful times, these joyful people, these joyful experiences you put in my life. And maybe today's the time just to pray that prayer. Or maybe I would suggest this, because I'm speaking primarily to God's people. But there may be some among you who have never become one of God's children. That is, a born-again believer in Jesus Christ. Someone who knows for certain he or she is going to heaven. You don't have that assurance. If you don't, you can come today and we'll at least sit down with you and explain to you how you can. Are we going to try to pressure you into some decision? Never. Not at this church. Not as long as I'm pastor. But I'll tell you what we will do. We'll be happy to explain to you what it means to be born again. So at the very, very least, you can have the knowledge of what it means. And then maybe at that point, you'll be ready to give your life to Christ. And maybe today's your day. Maybe the reason you just can't seem to get any joy is you don't have the master of joy in your life, and that's Jesus. And you can come. Say, Pastor, can I talk with someone about how to be saved? I'm going to pray, and then we're going to stand and sing. As we sing, I'm going to invite you to respond as God leads you. Father, right now, I pray that we would obey you, that we would respond to you in Jesus' name. You stand right where you are.